Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
We've looked at data across hundreds of thousands of meetings and different interactions. And what we found was that the C-suite specifically is involved 86% more than they were back in Q1, back in the January, February timeframe before we sort of went into the period that we're in right now. I'm a big fan of providing a quick recap, summary, fast, but demonstrating the credibility of why we're here, what we've done, the parties that are here, the key stakeholders we're working with, and bringing someone into that dialogue versus shifting the focus all to them.
Hello, Sales Nation. My name is Will Barrett, and I'm the host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most downloaded B2B sales show. On today's episode, we have the legend that is Jim Benton. He is the CEO over at Chorus.ai. And on today's show, we're getting into how to sell to the C-suite, and especially how to sell to the C-suite during this COVID pandemic, economic ups and downs and backs and forths that we're all going through. Jim shares some excellent data on this, and then adds a layer of really selling as a human, where rather than trying to rely on data as well. It's a fascinating episode. I took a ton away from it. I'm sure you will as well. And so with all that said, let's jump right into it. Okay, so we're going to get into how selling to the C-suite has changed, but I think that we've got to tee things up by asking for from yourself a quick 1-minute overview of what Chorus is, just so that we can then share where the data's come from, and it'll give a bit of context for the audience. So Jim, can you share just a very high-level overview of what Chorus is and where all this data is coming from?
Sure. So Chorus is a conversation intelligence platform. And that means that we hook in and capture all of the different interactions that a sales team would have. So we plug into the Zoom meetings that they're having. We hook into email. We're in their calendar. And by doing so, we can record the Zoom meetings by joining either as a additional attendee or through a native integration. But we're in the interactions. And then we're using really rich AI, backed by over 13 patents, to understand what's happening in these interactions. Are we asking the right questions? Are we setting next steps? Are we talking about certain features? Are there key trigger words that are coming up? And from there, we're then connecting this data back to your CRM, back to your organization, so that people can learn and really understand what does best look like? What drives deals that win versus lose? How do we replicate those moments successfully? How do we understand our relationships? And lastly, how do we bring the voice of the customer back to the entire organization? So we're helping sales teams to build these relationships, to understand the conversations, and ultimately to achieve the mission of their company faster.
Sure. So this is going to seem like a real stupid question. I'm going to ask it you because I feel like there's, again, more context will come out of this. Jim, how do we know what is best? So if we're analyzing voice data, we can tie that to CRM data. How do we know what is good, what is bad, what was a fluke, and what is going to lead to more success?
I think the key here is that because we're connected to the CRM, where we have all the different stages, we know if an opportunity went from stage 1 to stage 2, did it go to closed won versus closed lost? How long did it take it to advance the stage? That is the key outcome data that we're able to connect into to start to understand that when we talk about certain talk tracks, it leads to deals that win. So we can basically analyze the deals that win, understand the DNA and the formula, and start to map that back to the rest of the organization.
And is each organization siloed with its own data, or is this data, I guess, internally? And maybe this will lead to some of the metrics we're going to talk about. But is that data siloed internally, or is that data then shared to get best practices across entire industries?
Well, I think a couple ways to answer that. So each team has their own instance, of course, that is completely secure and a way for them to capture these interactions and kind of connect it back to the organization. And they can share the data internally via Slack and CRM and other means. But then from a coaching network standpoint, the way that our AI learns, there is a network effect. And it's very powerful that we can start to understand either different voice patterns and different aspects that we can apply across the AI data set.
Okay, so it's about a million things I want to ask here, Jim, but we'll narrow things down and perhaps we'll widen things up towards the end of the conversation. So what have you learned, or what's the AI learned about selling to the C-suite, and perhaps how has that changed via COVID and lockdown and working from home and everything else that everyone's going through at the moment?
Well, it's changed a lot. I think that's one of the key things we've looked at data across hundreds of thousands of meetings and different interactions. And what we found was that the C-suite specifically is involved 86% more than they were back in Q1, back in the January, February timeframe before we sort of went into the period that we're in right now. So they're far more involved in these deals, and we need to be ready for that in terms of how we prepare. We've seen that the CFOs are involved 92% more than they were before. That's a big deal. That means we need to be ready to talk to the CEO, be far more prepared on the ROI in terms of how we present that data. But we pulled basically, a series of data of how we've seen the C-suite engage differently now than we saw before. And I can walk you through it. I think the biggest thing is that because they're involved, we need to be ready for them. Even the little things, 10% of our meetings, the C-suite will just show up. They're not even invited on the meeting, but they'll be there. Are we ready for that? What will we do when we're there? What do they want out of these meetings? These are the things that we need to be ready for right now.
Do you do any, so this is all coming from the sales side, right? There's clear data on this. Do you do any interviews with the C-suite or any data pulling from that end of things to suss out perhaps why they are spending more time involved with sales meetings? Or do we have to do our best guess at that?
Well, I've been sitting down with different CROs and leaders weekly, asking them those questions. And even right when we went into lockdown back in March, I decided to kick off a daily briefing, sort of similar to what we were seeing from local officials, just to share the data. We were uncovering insights in the sales data that showed something different than what I thought the market would have expected, which was sales was absolutely engaging at levels that was similar, if not more, to what they were doing pre-lockdown. And that was a data point that we needed to share. And so we did 47 interviews with leaders asking them the question you're asking me, which is why, what's different? And I think what we were hearing, Will, is that, look, to get budgets were tighter and still are tighter during this period. It means that CFOs need to be more involved. Only the best opportunities are being signed off on. Therefore, leadership is more engaged. We are hearing things such as with travel, no longer in the mix in the short term. It's easier for executives to join. It's one click away to click on a Zoom link. So we found that meetings on Mondays were up from where they used to be versus prior period. More accessible. People weren't traveling. And so we were hearing from different leaders their rationale. And one of the biggest takeaways that we were hearing from leaders was around different categories. Certain categories were down 38% in terms of sales activity. This is more of HR, tech, recruiting, whereas other categories like collaboration and security and infrastructure were up 20%. And so from an ABM account perspective, we heard a lot of feedback about making sure to dynamically shift your attention to the deals that are in categories that are seeing an uptick right now.
I'm going to put you on the spot. I don't know if you will have this data, I'm sure, but I don't know if this has been parsed. But for a salesperson who typically perhaps deals with individuals a few steps down the C-suite, for them to see someone from the C-suite getting in on the Zoom calls with the potential customers and end users, is that a good sign or is that a bad sign for them?
Well, it's a good sign. We find that they will close. The specific data is that their win rates will increase by 15 points, which is 38% increase when C-suite is involved in these deals. So they should be thrilled, but they need to be ready when they come on. One of the other data points is that, CXOs, talk 8.5% more in the closed won deals. So they want to get their CXOs, the C-suite, talking when they get involved. They do not want to be just pitching them. They really need to be asking at least 5 engaging questions. And again, the CXOs talk more when we win deals. So we need to get them speaking in these interactions.
Sure. And let me ask you this from this perspective of a CEO. Would you personally get involved in a deal, even if you're just on the sideline to give support to the buying team or whatever it is, or the procurement team? Would you be involved because you want to? And again, try not to put you on the spot here, but would you in a scenario not anything to do with Chorus, you're a CEO of a random company, would you be getting involved to overlook, make sure that things are going through smoothly, or would you at this moment in time perhaps be there to start to kibosh things that shouldn't be going through, that may have slipped through the cracks in more nicer economic times previously?
A couple thoughts on that. One is I could see from a renewal perspective the vendors that you're working with to joining those, to wanting to make sure that we've got good partnerships in place. People are doing what's right during this time, and that pricing is fair. And so in that case, sometimes it does take a CXO to join to just help to level set. And we found that both buying and selling had significant increases in CX, in C-suite participation. It wasn't just the buying side; the selling side is bringing the leadership as well. In terms of your question on a deal, when the C-suite's involved, I think it depends on how. If we're being brought into it, invited in, I think that's a far more positive sign than just showing up unannounced. But either way, it means that something's about to happen, good or bad, and we're in a decision mode. And again, the data says that we're 38% more likely to win that deal. So we just need to make sure we use that time wisely when the C-suite is there.
Okay, and I'm just trying to build this context. I used to work in medical device sales. A lot of my deals went through perfectly fine. Every now and again, the CFO of the hospital, the local trust group of hospitals, would jump in, and sometimes they were just interested. They just wanted to know what was going on. Sometimes they were looking for proactively looking to reduce costs or change terms and do all these things. So I'm just trying to build a bit of context here, Jim, for the audience who perhaps have never dealt with someone in the C-suite before, a CXO, CFO, CEO, whoever it is. And I think you've done that really nicely for us there. Okay, so we're on this Zoom call, and Jim jumps in, and we're going, I've listened to this podcast, and he said it's probably a good thing, but I'm slightly nervous. I've got to get him to speak 8% more to get the deal done right. Yeah. What questions do we need to be asking yourself or the CXO who's jumped in on our Zoom call to involve them in the conversation and make the conversation a good use of their time as well as trying to get the deal done?
Well, I think we have some interesting stats on this, but on the questions, look, just a personal perspective, just being authentic, asking them why. I love the DO perspective, a desired outcome. What would be their desired outcome? If this call were to be successful, what would you need to get out of it today? And just that's some of the language that I enjoy, but just being really crisp on the purpose, on what they would like to get out of this. What would be some of the reasons that they were joining? You should expect that they'll talk less than 20% of the time based on the data that we see. And that can equate to simply speaking for 3.5 to 6 minutes, in some of these cases. So it can be very brief. But just asking them what they want to make sure that you're really focused on their specific needs is critical.
So again, it seems like a stupid question, but how do we ask that question without seeming like we're massively unprepared? Should we ask it, Jim, in a sense of, hey, we've made this hypothesis, is this what you're after? Or should we ask a truly open-ended question to try and really uncover something that perhaps we may have missed?
Look, I'm a big fan of providing a quick recap, summary, fast, but demonstrating the credibility of why we're here, what we've done, the parties that are here, the key stakeholders we're working with, and bringing someone into that dialogue versus shifting the focus all to them.
Sure.
And I think that even in my own shoes, I don't. Most likely, the CEOs aren't making the decisions or don't want to be coming in to make that final decision. They want to be participating in that and supporting it. And so I think bringing them into the dialogue, he or she into that dialogue so that they're part of it, but it's not the spotlight's not on them, asking them potentially what we could be doing to make this a successful outcome for them or any key questions, and having a great dialogue across the group. What we find if the CXO is involved, they don't spend a lot of time. Our sales teams don't spend a lot of time in decks across the platform. They will spend more time demoing. So it's an interesting data point that very little of their time will be spent in decks. They'll spend 42% more time seeing demos in these cases.
So Jim, other than asking the CXO what they want out of the meeting, their objectives, are there any other very specific questions we should be asking?
Well, I think that some of the dialogue around would there be any reason not to move forward? Is there, I think that the ROI is something that we're definitely seeing. Knowing that the CXO might have the CFO there, I think that our preparation on being able to justify and walk them through and then ask dialogue about, are we on the same page? Are these resonating? Are we validating the data? That part's critical. But again, I think the authenticity is so key here. It's not about the question. It's about engaging people and connecting with them and building the trust to do that. It's demonstrating that we are well prepared and that we are going to be able to solve their problems. And I think that's what sales is all about. We solve problems. And so do we understand their problem? And are we the best solution to solve it? And if so, we need to make that incredibly clear to folks so that we can move forward and, they'll be thanking us for solving their problems.
We're going to a slight sidetrack here, but does Chorus understand, or the AI understand, when someone is engaged or not engaged, or whether, I guess, someone's on a phone call or a demo and they're just plodding along as opposed to they're really excited to speak with you?
Yeah, we'll capture, it's funny. Well, I mean, at the baseline, even just looking at talk time, how much talk time are, we both having right now and as a group? And sometimes you'll identify that certain people aren't as engaged and they need to be pulled into a conversation. Zoom just launched a new feature called the Zaps that will come out later this year. They announced it at Zoomtopia that allows, we were one of the featured launch partners, but allows us to actually be in the Zoom meeting live so that we can start to capture in real time how much time, Will, you're talking versus me, and help to coach people into how to bring the right people into that dialogue. The other things we'll look at is filler words or patience score. We joke a lot about the patience score internally, but are we pausing enough? Are we speaking fast or speaking slowly? Are we using a lot of ums and ahs? The AI is picking up all of this. And at the end of each call, it's coaching us and giving us insights, as well as sort of a green, yellow, red on where we go, including monologue. If you talk for too long, we know that that's not helpful. That doesn't lead to positive outcomes. So we try to coach reps to not have these long monologues anywhere in a pitch.
So I've got two follow-up questions to that, Jim. One, how far are we away from this happening, this coaching happening in real time? Whether it's, I don't know how the UI would be, you're barreling along and a stop hand or stop sign comes up to tell you to shut up because you've been rabbiting on for too long. How far are we from that happening and giving that real-time feedback to salespeople?
Yeah, well, we just announced that a few weeks ago, real-time relationship intelligence inside the Zoom meeting. Now that said, Will, what does the community want? As a seller, you've been in sales, I've been in sales. We need to be incredibly focused. I mean, right now, you and I talking, there's not a lot of room to look at other screens, sure, to be, multitasking. And I don't think either of us want to be multitasking. So I think the key is, what are we looking to do in real time? And one of the key things that the industry is looking for is being able to take notes in real time, and not just, average notes where but time-stamped notes down to the specific moment that we said something or you said something. That's some of the magic and the innovations that's coming to the space. We'll be launching that as part of our Zap. But in a Zoom meeting, be able to take a note or tag somebody in the company, as well as my teammates taking notes. We'd have kind of team-based notes down to the moment. But on the coaching, I think that the talk time's interesting. There is we can create some awareness, but the overall feedback we constantly hear is you got to keep the distraction level very, very low. You need to be almost invisible in these meetings, from colors to everything. Let the core focus stay on the participant in the meeting and don't get in the way.
And again, I'm sure, a company based on science like Chorus seemingly is, with a focus on data. And this may be coming in the future, but has that been tested of you have a better a conversation with no distractions and then guidance afterwards versus a conversation with lots of distractions but that are trying to poke you and prod you in the right direction towards the an endpoint of a call which is satisfactory to everyone who's on it?
We will be testing that feature will go live most likely end of the year when Zoom pushes that. That'll allow us to try all sorts of different pieces there. And right now where we're testing is we're getting feedback. So we'll showing a lot of the different design language that we have and getting feedback from VPs and sellers of here's what's going live. What are your thoughts? And it's been interesting. I would say some of the feedback has has changed even the way we've thought about our design on this, specifically around colors, just to be as neutral as possible.
Sure.
But to your point, we could turn on far more proactive coaching in the moment, and that will be something that we'll be testing and turning the dials on as we get this live.
And I never really thought about this before, but it's actually hilarious if we could do it on both sides. But does this technology exist for example, a professional procurement team who are dealing with salespeople day in, day out? Could this technology be flipped on its head and used to help them better communicate with salespeople?
I think so. Look, I think we're in the relationships business. We're all about helping to develop these brilliant relationships and to help companies bring their best. So most likely this is when folks are talking to external folks out there, whether it's partners or vendors or customers or prospects. How do we just make sure you represent the company well? And to your point, can we use an augmentation where there's an intelligence layer that's helping us to be the best? If a question comes up, to be able to do that, we're advancing into that. The question is, what are the areas that really add core value, and where do you start on that? And I think that some of the awareness is important. Surfacing different type of content could be important over time. But again, I think that note taking, oddly enough, is the core feature that everybody is just really jonesing for, which is how do we make sure that we can timestamp specific notes and get it right back to the CRM as we shut down that meeting.
Yeah, I do a show with Victor Antonio called This Week in Sales, and one of the title bits of news that we covered last week was, I'm going to butcher the numbers, but it was something like 70% of salespeople would rather clean their bathroom than input data into the CRM. So I think if you just eliminate even just a fraction of that kind of work, you're not just making salespeople more efficient, you're probably improving the experience at work as well, right?
Well, and I think that's look, I've been in the sales tech space now for, 10 plus years as a co-founder or CEO, and selling for 20 plus years. It's not even just entering the notes. That's a very limited data stream. The voice, what you and I are doing right now, the voice, the video, your background, the subtle head nod that you're having, this is such rich signal. And so this conversation plus AI is the missing link to understanding relationships. When you think about CRM, there really isn't a whole lot of R in the CRM still, right? There's a lot of C and a lot of M. We have a great database and we understand who manages this. But the sense of relationships does not exist anywhere in the sales industry. And that's what I think conversation intelligence is about. We put the R in the CRM, which is far more than some light notes that people don't want to put in. This interaction should be straight in the CRM right when we click end today. And then when you analyze this with AI, you start to pull out signals. Did we talk about a competitor or pricing, or did a legal objection come up, or did procurement get mentioned? Even little things like you could build triggers such as, if I mention, let me talk to my SC about that. That'll send an email at the end of this call, right straight to my SC to listen to that exact moment of the call to find out why I said that. Those unique workflows is a completely new unlock that's happening in sales, which is why this category has been so hot.
As you're saying this, Jim, I can just picture me being stood next to a surgeon in an operating room, surgeons kind of hands deep inside a patient, and we're having a conversation. And it'd be difficult to record that clearly. We're talking about Zoom calls, phone calls, and audio calls here. But I'm sure that'll be a real-time recording of in-person meetings. Will become more appropriate and will exist at some point. Well, there must be hundreds of things that I left the operating room, made some notes, typed it into the CRM. There will be hundreds, if not thousands, of occasions where I've said I'll do something, or I said I'd look into something, or this or that. And by the time you've got out your scrubs, it got changed, it's gone in one ear and out the other, despite your best intentions. So there's real value into this, just from the standpoint of just not missing stuff.
Not missing stuff. And then when you think about how we sell today, it's not just one person. A, we're multi-threading, but B, we're team selling. We're bringing in BDRs and CSMs and SCs and leaders. Do we want going back to the C-suite, do we really want our CEOs to join these calls as just a relationship person saying, hi, nice to meet you? Or do we want them listening to the first call and understanding what the pain points were and hearing the stream of interactions that come in with a running start and they add value to an interaction versus just being a figurehead? And I think that that's different. So how do we make sure everyone's on point everyone can understand the previous interaction with rich detail. And I think that that's really about this complete relationship intelligence, which is we need to understand the full spectrum of this. And that's, go back to your doctor analogy. Reading a few notes versus someone that videoed, as we've seen operating room footage, imagine it being studied and having both audio and video, and then augmenting that with additional notes that maybe the doctor wants to provide. I think a year from now, when people look back at that surgery, if there's a complication, that would be far rich more data than just the notes. That's what we're doing in sales. We have to renew these deals every year. How do you go back and understand the key reasons why people bought and make sure we're connecting that a year later? There's just a richness of signal that has never existed, and it's fundamentally changing sales. And I was a customer, by the way, of this category. I was a customer of Chorus before I joined. And that's where I got that aha moment of, we've never had this level of data before.
Sure. And a conversation over time, but I feel like, and you alluded to it earlier, you said the word content, tying this into content or even dynamically generating content when there's enough data from enough accounts, and you can make it very, internally specifically for your customers, and what works, what doesn't, from open rates and click rates and people viewing and watching things. This all ties together in just a machine of grabbing attention, building relationships, and also just developing that relationship and moving it forward, right?
Yeah, I think the third area is the voice of the customer is so powerful, and it does not make it back to much of the organization today. Think about how many times most CEOs, CROs, marketing leaders, product leaders literally hear the voice of the customer. And now what you find is that you're constantly sharing 38-second snippet where here's exactly what the customer said about this new feature we launched, or our new pricing, or this or that. And they're sending the exact recording to these other leaders, either via Slack or email, whatever the mechanism is. Well, that being empowered with the voice of the customer is incredibly empowering to help drive decisions. And I think it's much better than if a support rep said, hey, so-and-so said that they didn't like a feature. Okay, we'll add it to the list. But when you say, listen to this recording about what this key person just said about a feature, that can shoot straight to the top. It just resonates. So suddenly, we're creating thousands and thousands of hours of conversations of customers that can now make it back to product and marketing to help build a better business. That's the brilliance of these relationships, is that they're now driving a far more customer-centric decision-making process.
Yeah, that makes total sense. In fact, I'm not going to ask you to do this, but you could even put something like this podcast through your algorithm, and I bet you could pull out all kinds of trends and when things were hot. And 3 years ago, every conversation was about social selling, and now less so, and it's all about Zoom. And there's probably mountains of data just online published by organizations. If you wanted to use the algorithm in a different way, rather than kind of real time with customers, if you wanted to do research on an industry or a marketplace, you could do it there with that as well.
I think that's right. I think to that point, one of the challenges as a sales leader is there's too many, these recordings take a long time to watch. This podcast takes a long time and to watch if you had to watch a lot of these per day. So even the little things, watching something at 2x speed means you cut a 30-minute meeting to 15 minutes. And if I were to upload this podcast into Chorus, into these platforms, suddenly the team could comment on specific moments and share snippets to add to our training library of how so-and-so told this story. We know that telling stories increases win rates 20%. Top performers tell 20% more stories. And so how do we pull out the stories, from this podcast and make sure they're easy to find? So I think the key is how do you identify those key moments so that people can jump into those versus having to watch an entire recording, which is just too much time.
Yeah, people just aren't going to do it, are they? I know this phenomenon well of being given a huge bank of content and physical books to give to surgeons, to trainees, and then of course you don't give anyone any of it because you don't have time to read it yourself, so you can't parse down to what actually is useful for your buyer. Jim, well, I'll ask you a couple of questions here made to wrap up, because I could ask you another 50 on this topic and dive deeper into it, but a couple of questions I ask everyone that comes on the show, mate. Other than Chorus, what is a book, a resource, some kind of training that you'd recommend for anyone who's listening to the show right now who wants to improve their ability to sell?
A book that I just love is Built to Last by Jim Collins. And I think from a sales perspective, it's the concept of purpose. When you read that book, really focusing on the purpose side of things, you can get into the BHAG and the envisioned future. But I just think purpose, it goes back to the DO, the desired outcome, but it's bigger than that. It's the why, and how are you going to help people, which is what purpose is about. I just love that. So built to last, Jim Collins.
Good stuff. I'll link that in the show notes over at salesman.org. And final question, Jim, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Continue to make it happen. Sales is about making things happen, being authentic, and being real. And just don't ever lose it. Don't ever get too formulaic. Make things happen. Stand out. Be different.
Do you know what, Jim? Again, this isn't a topic for another time, but you're a man of data. You're running a company based on data, and yet every time I've kind of gone down that route, you're always pulled back to that level of authenticity. Why is that? Is that just because we can be formulaic, we can use systematic selling processes, but is the difference that gets the deal done that personality, that layer on top?
I want to be a tech-enabled human, not a human-enabled tech. And I think sales started to become sort of humans behind the technology. You're buying from people. And I think that's why it's about relationships. How do we use the data to coach us, to develop better relationships, to bring our best? I want you to have the best experience of all of us at Chorus. So what should I say? How can I be my best? But it is about the human side. That's why we're doing this live. If it was just data, you should buy on our website. But when two humans come together to solve some of the toughest problems, it'll require developing strong relationships to understand what your problem is. And if I do have a solution that can unlock it. And if we do, we have a deal, and that's sales, and we move the world forward. And that is helping you achieve your mission faster and giving us satisfaction. I just think that's the special part of what we all do.
That's very smart. I love it, Jim. I love it. That is, I've tried to say something very similar to that on a couple of shows recently. You've said more on just an offhand comment more eloquently than I've managed to. So I appreciate that, Jim. With that, mate.
I appreciate it.
With that, mate, tell us where we can find out more about you and where we can find Chorus as well.
Yeah, you can go to chrous.ai and sign up for a demo or check out the site. And I'm just Jim Benton. You can find me on LinkedIn.
Good stuff. Well, I'll link to that and everything else that we talked about, including that book, over at salesman.org in the show notes. And with that, Jim, I want to thank you for your time, your insights, the data, and everything else that gets laid on top of this. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Appreciate it, Will. Thanks, buddy.